G'day and welcome to a special episode of Science Radio. My name's Jesse and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host, as ever, Zanita. Hi, Zanita.
Hey, Jesse, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good. Feeling
Very
well
good, very
rested
good.
after 4 days off. It's pretty fun.
That's right. Which brings us into what we're talking about today, because we have just come off the Easter break, as many people around the world have. And it was confirmed barely a day ago that on Easter Monday, Pope Francis has passed away. So to give you guys a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, a lot of the time we record these episodes fairly well in advance. It doesn't really matter when we release them, but there are certain events that kind of pop up and it would be better to jump on them while they're sort of happening. And this is definitely one of those instances.
Yeah, this is pretty fresh.
It's pretty fresh. Yeah, it is pretty fresh. And of course, Pope Francis has been in and out of hospital for a couple of weeks now. We actually discussed a couple of weeks ago when it first happened, when he was first admitted to hospital for, I believe, pneumonia was the reason, of doing a what if kind of expose on what would happen if the Pope died while in office. And so I wrote an article on this and published it a couple of weeks back, and it did pretty well. But coming into what's happened now, everything has kind of changed. So, Zanita, I just want to ask from the top, what is your understanding of your knowledge of what might happen if and when a Pope dies?
Well, this is actually, I basically was coming here with a lot of questions for you, Jesse. But I was looking up at how, I was like, obviously when the Queen dies, there's like a whole ceremony where the next person comes in. So in this case, Charles stepped in and replaced the Queen. But then there was like a period in between of mourning, which I believe also happens with the Pope, but it's slightly different. But I believe there's a period of mourning before the funeral. And that's basically my understanding of what happens. But I don't really know what the differences are in terms of like, do they still do this like they did with the Queen, or because it's like, a different sect, does something else happen? But that's kind of my understanding. I don't know how the next Pope gets elected, what happens with that. But yeah, that's kind of my general gist.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to talk all about that in this episode because, as you mentioned, the process of what happens when a Pope dies is fairly extensive. It's shrouded in a lot of secrecy, and the rituals that are practiced in this particular sort of process, many of them date back centuries. So there's some new and a lot of old, but it's all very much within the veil of tradition and, as I mentioned, secrecy. So there's a lot we're not going to know, but we do know the basic structure of what happens. And in fact, this is something that a lot of people are probably not all that familiar with, especially those in our generation, because I don't know how old you were when the last Pope died, but I was pretty young. I was a kid. It was 2005 when we last had a Pope die in office. Because as you might remember, the previous Pope actually resigned, Pope Benedict XVI, which is the first time that's happened in more than 600 years. So this whole process is relatively new.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure if, obviously, I'm a lot more aware of the Pope and who's in leadership these days just because I'm older and I'm a bit more updated on news as opposed to when I was like a teenager. And so I was thinking, I was like, is this Pope more significant or more well-known or more well-liked or more controversial than the Popes in the past? Or is it just because I'm more aware of things these days? I don't know if you can speak into that. Has there been anything like significant about Pope Francis, or has he just kind of been another Pope?
Well, I mean, Pope Francis has not been without his controversies. I think that's probably fair to say. He stepped into the Vatican at a time when trust in the Vatican was very low. So I don't know if you remember much about what was happening under Pope Benedict XVI, but the Vatileaks or Vatican leaks scandal was happening, and basically what that was a whole bunch of priests were caught in sexual abuse cases, and in many of those cases, priests were not adequately brought to justice. The Vatican, in fact, covered up a lot of these abuse cases and simply moved priests on to different parishes. And this bombshell series of documents were leaked to the press in this time that demonstrated how not just the cardinals, but also Pope Benedict had a hand in covering up some of these abuse cases. And so trust was at an all-time low for the Catholic Church at this point, and one of the more outspoken cardinals in criticising this approach was then the Cardinal of Buenos Aires, now Pope Francis, and he was actually a bit of an upset that he was elected at this time, and he has definitely, I think, solidified a legacy of being more, I suppose you could say, open to hearing victims' cases and social justice specifically, not just in the cases of abuse, but in many other areas as well.
Yeah, and I know we were talking about, well, I don't know, maybe this is just a straightforward question. Like, what, in today's society, we're, I guess, seeing a society that is becoming more and more secular, and that maybe is, like, losing touch with religion and church and I guess the idea of having that belief. And what is the role of the Pope in the future of society that is kind of heading in that direction, I suppose? Like, does society at large, do you think, still see a need for a Pope, or do you think that's something that in the future that possibly people will be like, we don't need this?
Well, you've got to remember there are around 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. So whether those are nominal Catholics or ardent Catholics, I mean, we're part of a denomination, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that has just north of 20 million members worldwide. So when you put that into perspective, we're just a tiny drop in the ocean. There's a lot of Catholics. And so I think there's always going to be a need for a Pope. And for Catholics, I think the papal office is more than just the CEO of the company. I think to compare the Pope to, in our case, we have what's called the General Conference, and that General Conference has a president. Many people like to point out the fact that our General Conference president isn't the president of the World Church, he's the president of the General Conference, which is the highest level of bureaucracy and administration within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But I don't think any Adventist sees our General Conference president as their spiritual father, whereas that's the case for Catholics. The term Pope literally comes from the Latin term father, and that's kind of what he is. He is the father of all Catholics worldwide. Now, to your point, the Pope definitely, every Pope has their own set of priorities or emphases. Pope Benedict was very much a traditionalist. He was keen on upholding the traditions of the Catholic Church. He had he tried really hard to sort of rally the conservative part of the church. He really wanted to try and bring the sort of dwindling European section of the Catholic Church back to sort of revitalization. And he had some successes in some areas. But Pope Francis, on the other hand, I think has definitely been a pope for the poor. He's been a pope for the developing world. He's been a pope for the LGBTQ community as well. He has been pretty staunch against gay marriage. That's been something that he's drawn the line at. But before that line, he has definitely advocated for the rights of people who maybe don't, fit a cisgender, you could say, sexuality, advocating for them to be involved in the life of the church in different ways. And he's definitely been criticized for that. And so when we think of the future, I mean, Pope Francis stepped into his role, what was it, about, I'm just trying to do the maths in my head, 15, 16, 17 years ago, something like that, almost 2 decades. He definitely stepped into the role at a time when I think the world was a little less divided and a little bit more hopeful. And I think now the world is a lot more divided and less hopeful than it once was. So I do think that whoever steps into the papal role will have a huge influence over the world, not just for Catholics, but for all of us.
Yeah, totally. So it sounds like he's been, like you said, a support for a lot of people and an advocate for a lot of people. And I think, did you say there was 1.4 billion Catholics around the world?
Yeah, there's 1.3.
1.3, okay. So
around about that. Well, between 1.3 and 1.4.
Yeah. So how have we seen, I guess, in the last 24 hours, the last day, so how is the world kind of responding to the Pope's passing?
It's been responding a couple different ways. I think most of the major outlets have emphasized Francis's, I suppose, social, political kind of legacy. He, as I mentioned, has been an outspoken advocate for the poor. One of the things that he really emphasized when he came into the role was the fact that he came from the poor streets of Buenos Aires in Argentina. He was the first Jesuit to ever hold the seat. He was also the first Latin American to ever be Pope. And he was also the first person from the Southern Hemisphere to be a Pope. So we've had American popes, we've had European popes, but we've never, funnily enough, never had anybody below the equator. And so I think Francis's legacy, I mean, it's hard to tell, right, from the first initial hours, but I think Francis probably will be recognized and remembered for his advocacy for the poor, for his advocacy in the fight against climate change. Again, because the way that he saw it, climate change affected mostly those in poor areas.
Sure, yeah.
Areas like the ones he grew up in Argentina. So I think these are the issues that he will probably most be remembered for. He was also, I think, again, to contrast with Pope Benedict, he was a much more down-to-earth and simple Pope. I don't know if you remember a lot of the get-up, the garb, the sort of clothes that Benedict wore versus Pope Francis, but when he came in, it was quite a shock because Benedict really embraced the complexity, the lavishness of the papal sort of garb, and Pope Francis donned, many remember, that simple white cloak and that sort of very, very plain sort of clothing that I think reflected his connection, his affinity with the poor. So, yeah.
Awesome. So they're the things he's obviously going to be known for and the legacy he's going to leave behind. Maybe just quickly we could brush on. I feel like when someone dies, obviously we get like the highlight reel of like who they are. And you mentioned like homosexuality and a few other things before. In terms of him being a controversial figure, was that mostly around that, or were there a number of other things that made him like controversial?
Well, I think if you think about the issues that he was strong on, within
they're
the Catholic, yeah, they're big issues. They're not issues that are, light or whatever. So yes, I mean within Catholic theology, there is obviously a fairly wide spectrum of belief, as there is in most other denominations or faith structures. So more conservative Catholics definitely took umbrage with a lot of his stances. As I said, he was still pretty hard and fast when it came to drawing a line with gay marriage, for instance, but he did advocate for same-sex couples to receive political benefits that married couples would. And this is different for different parts of the world, of course. And in some parts of the world, if you are a same-sex couple and you're in a de facto relationship, you will receive some of the same benefits from the government that a straight couple would, but in some places that's not the case. He advocated for priests to bless the unions of same-sex couples, but keenly, notably, again, as I said, that line was drawn at marriage. So he still advocated for a marriage being between a man and a woman, but he continually advocated for seeing gay and transgender Catholics as being part of the Catholic body. He was big about, and of course that drew a lot of controversy from different people. We have to remember as well, many very influential political leaders around the world are themselves Catholic. Until recently, we had, I believe, only the second Catholic president in United States history. Joe Biden was a Catholic. I believe the only Catholic president before that was JFK. I may be wrong on that, but there haven't been that many. And even when JFK became Catholic, one of the big reasons why his opponents mistrusted him was because he was Catholic. And you have to remember that America was very much founded on Protestant principles. And so a lot of these issues are not just spiritual issues, but they're also political issues, climate change, of course, being one of them. And so these are, I think, issues that will make Francis remembered probably in a good way, but also probably in a less good way for certain people, depending on your political persuasion.
Yeah, it all depends on who you talk to.
Yeah.
All right, so now we have it and he's passed away. Ironically, I think it's kind of ironic that he's passed away over Easter. And we mentioned before, when the Queen passes, there's like an immediate succession where the new person steps into place, and then there's like an elaborate funeral. What happens with the Pope? Do they also have a period of mourning, or what's going on from here forward?
Yeah, well, a lot happens, and I probably have to give a warning and an apology ahead of time. I'm gonna say a bunch of words that are in Latin, and I'm probably gonna butcher a lot of them. So if you speak Latin or Italian, I apologize. So immediately upon the Pope's passing, we enter a period that is known as the sede vacante. This is the vacant period. So vacante, the vacant period between popes. This is the waiting period. And during this period, I think until the College of Cardinals, the most important figure that we need to know about is the Pope's Camerlengo. The Camerlengo is basically the administrative custodian of the Vatican, the Holy See. Everything that happens in the Holy See, he's kind of like the guy who's in charge. Below the Pope, of course, but the Camerlengo basically oversees all of the daily activities, the properties, the grounds, everything that happens within it, and crucially during the sede vacante, he basically is the ceremonial bridge between the death of the Pope and the appointment of the next Pope. So there's a lot of things that happens, but basically the Camerlengo, who's currently, it has to be a cardinal, and the current one is Cardinal Kevin Farrell. He will go into the Pope's quarters and he will administer the death rites. He will call out to the Pope in his baptismal name, "Are you sleeping?" and in Latin. And if the Pope does not respond, then the Camerlengo declares the Pope to be dead.
It's kind of like the vice captain.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Nice.
So the Camerlengo then will take the fisherman's ring. So this is the ring that it's like the ring of St. Peter, Peter the fisherman, and he will cut that in half, and that will sort of signify the end of the authority of this particular Pope. A couple of other things will happen during this day, but then, of course, the doctors will be called in. They'll declare the Pope dead, the time of death, all that sort of thing. And then crucially, the Camerlengo will he'll basically release the will of the Pope and will basically pass on authority to the Dean of the College of Cardinals. The Pope will remain interred in his apartments briefly, and the official... Yes?
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that the Pope, the will of the Pope will be released. Can the Pope insert things into his will that still take place after he dies? Does he still have that?
That's interesting.
Control.
You know, I'm not sure. I suppose because most popes will have their own private properties. I would imagine goods. It's a little bit. I guess it's a little bit easy because most popes don't have children to pass on things to. So it's probably not too extensive. But I imagine that it's the responsibility of the Camerlengo and maybe the College of Cardinals to make sure that any particular wishes are fulfilled by whoever needs to fulfill them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, one of the other things that the Pope, the current Pope, one of the other things that the previous Pope, Pope Francis, instituted was that when the body is taken to St. Peter's Basilica, which is where they are displayed so that people can come and pay their respects, up until this point, the Pope was sort of displayed with an open casket, preserved, of course, but an open casket so that people could come and see the Pope. Pope Francis made it the case that you can't do that anymore. The casket is sealed. And so for whatever reason, he felt that was appropriate. So for anybody who's going to go to St. Peter's Basilica in the coming days to pay respects to Francis, he will be in a sealed coffin. Mm-hmm. So that is where he will be, and he will be for a number of days because the period basically between what I've just described and the conclave, which is the juicy part of this whole conversation. It's known as the Novemdialas. Again, I apologize for butchering these words, but this is the 9-day period of mourning.
Okay.
And the papal funeral will usually take place within a week of the Pope's passing. Basically, what that means is every eligible cardinal from around the world, and we'll talk more about the cardinal soon, basically once the Pope has been declared dead, every cardinal that's eligible from around the world has a couple of days to a week to get to Rome in order to attend the funeral and then to take part in the conclave. So the 1 week is basically to allow cardinals from all around the world and anybody else who might need to come from all corners of the earth to get to Rome to be able to be part of it.
It's like a pilgrimage.
Yeah, I think many
all the contestants.
There's photos of Francis when he actually took his pilgrimage, I suppose you could say, all the way from the bottom of the world. I mean, Argentina is a pretty long way. It's really interesting to see photos of him when he was flying to Rome, because he just looks like any other cardinal. And at that point, nobody really had any indication that he was going to be the next pope. So it's really interesting to see some of those in retrospect. And there are popes, and there is a cardinal who is either on his way or about to be on his way right now, who is going through that same process.
Do they just on their journeys to Rome, do they just get in cars and planes, or is this more of like a unique pilgrimage, like the Camino?
Well, I think it's probably depending on who you are. I mean, I think a lot of them fly on private jets, but I think a lot of them probably it's a fairly low key event. Yeah. I imagine they're probably flying first class, but I'm not a cardinal.
Okay.
I'll let you know when I become a cardinal.
Yeah, nice. All right. So what happens next?
So, basically, from the passing of the Pope, there is a week's period where the funeral mass can take place. There's a whole bunch of things that happen, but the important thing is that from the point that the Pope passes, they have 15 days to convene the conclave. The conclave is the process by which the new Pope is elected. And there are 252 cardinals that exist right now in the world, but only 137 of them are eligible to attend the conclave, because of those 252, only the 137, and this is at the time of me writing the article, so this will change in the future, only those 137 are under the age of 80. You cannot be 80 years of age or over in order to be considered in the conclave. So 137 of these men from all around the world will convene in Rome, and they will attend the conclave together. The Camerlengo is still somewhat part of this, but then he will hand over sort of authority, I suppose you could say, to the Dean of the College of Cardinals. This is the man who basically will guide the College of Cardinals throughout this process. And there is a series of sermons that take place. They will, these are, by the way, these 137, they're called cardinal electors. In other words, they are eligible to elect the next pope. And they, upon arrival, will hear two sermons from the dean. The purpose is to sort of talk about the state of the world, what's happening in the world right now, as well as to kind of lay out, the dean will lay out sort of his vision for the kind of qualities necessary for the Pope who is going to step into St. Peter's chair in this cultural moment, I suppose you could say.
So there really are a lot of candidates for the next Pope. It's not like when a presidential election is coming up and you kind of have a vague idea about who's running. There are no political parties. Yeah.
It's really a fairly open question. Now, having said that, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit at the end, there are a couple of candidates who are, well, deemed by some of the press to be more in the running than others. But as we should probably have learned from Francis's election, you really can't be sure about who truly is the front runner until it's sort of announced. Because the thing that happens is, unlike a political election in any democratic country, this is all happening behind closed doors. So the Dean of the College of Cardinals will close the door, will expel anybody else. So they go into St. Peter's Basilica, they'll go into the Pauline Chapel to sort of convene, and then they'll go into the Sistine Chapel. And the Sistine Chapel is basically where a lot of the goings-on will happen. And anybody else will be expelled. It's interestingly enough, apparently a number of years ago, in previous conclaves, some members of the press have tried to sort of disguise themselves as servants to try to get that inside scoop kind of thing. So it's definitely it's a secretive event.
Yeah, so interesting. Okay, and so I'm guessing that the world doesn't have much say in, like, it's not like it narrows down to 12 people and then we all go to a ballot and vote, or it's a bit different, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is a bit different. So there'll be more discussions, more sermons will be taking place, but we really can't be sure with any great deal of certainty about anything that happens behind closed doors. It might be the case that some cardinals will go in, and I think it's probably fairly likely that each of the cardinals will go in having an idea of belonging to one faction or another. or leaning a certain way. But again, there's no way to really know unless you're an insider who they are, what interests they represent, and who they might want to see, be the next pope, and for what reason. So all that is going to be going on, but ultimately the dean of the College of Cardinals is the one who kind of is driving this train, and it's through the discussion and it's through a series of ballots that the next pope is going to be decided.
I was at church for Easter over the weekend, and the central message that was kind of shared at church was that Easter is like an opportunity for a fresh start. And I think the Pope passing is kind of the same, because with the Pope passing comes a new Pope, which also brings a fresh start. And I think even though they follow the same religion and probably the same doctrine, we know this from our faith in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that every individual kind of has slightly different beliefs or ways of doing things. Do you have any idea as to what a new Pope might bring to the table?
Well, this, I think, is the key question. The only way that you can really know is to know the cardinals.
Yeah. Or maybe another question is, what are people do you know what people are kind of hoping that a new Pope will bring?
I think that probably a lot of conservative Catholics are probably hoping for more of a return to the kind of Pope that Benedict was, somebody to uphold tradition. And you got to remember, the Catholic Church, basically its authority is based on its tradition. Whenever there is a controversy or a question about doctrine or social event or some kind of issue, tradition is usually the thing that is held up as being the the thing at which the buck stops, I suppose you could say. So I think there are some conservative Catholics who probably would want a more conservative Pope. I wonder if there are some Catholics who might prefer a European Pope over somebody whose interests has definitely been more served in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia. Francis definitely represented an advocate not just for the poor, but for developing nations and for developing parts of the world and Catholics who lived there. But having said that, there might be some Catholics who feel that maybe Francis was a stepping stone to some bright new progressive future, that it might be time to have a black pope or an Asian pope, which has never been the case before. Francis definitely broke the mold in many cases, as we've already mentioned, in being first for many different characteristics. But perhaps some Catholics might feel like it's time to get a pope from Africa or from Asia, somebody who can build on the successes and the legacy of Francis. If that's the case, if those are sort of the two broad camps, which may or may not be, who can say, it'll be interesting to see who might win.
Hold on, everyone. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
I wish there was a way we could see the whole election. I shouldn't say election because it's such a political term, but the process of how they choose and all the different candidates. But
and the reality is, we'll never know.
Yeah, I'd love to listen to these world-changing sermons, to be honest.
Yeah.
They've probably put a lot of time into them.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you wanted to land on, Jesse, or have we kind of covered?
Yeah, so basically what the next pope will need in order to succeed is a 2/3 supermajority. And so what that really represents is an overwhelming vote of trust by the majority of cardinals. So in other words, whoever the next pope is, whether they are a conservative, a progressive, or some kind of moderate, they will need to have the support of more than half, 2/3 of the cardinals present. And there have been cases where some popes have... there have been cases where there are some non-obvious candidates, and it has taken the conclave a long time to elect the next pope. So in the case of Benedict XIV, I believe, off the top of my head, I think it was 180 days before he was elected. So this is a long time ago, but it took a long time in that case. So it could be the case that we might see a long conclave if there is not an obvious candidate. If the candidate presents himself obviously and is able to win over the majority, then we might see one quickly. So it's really difficult to tell what's going to happen, but whoever gets in is going to need the trust of the majority of cardinals. That's the only way that it's going to happen. And somehow, somewhere, Francis was able to achieve that way back last time. And so it just remains to be seen whether or not there is a candidate that can present themselves in such a way to win over the cardinals in this case. There are a couple front runners, so it would be remiss of me to not mention a couple. There is an Italian cardinal by the name of Pietro Parolin, who is a front runner. He was close to Francis, and he was the Vatican secretary since Francis came in. So he negotiated a lot. He was sort of a diplomat, and he's Italian, so he would probably be seen as a moderate. He's obviously very much European, but supposedly, according to what I've been able to read, he would probably be a continuation in some ways of Francis's legacy. Then there's Luis Antonio Tagle, who is from the Philippines. He's the former Archbishop of Manila, and he is in an area that has a rapidly growing Catholic population. He, at one point, was Francis's preference as far as successor, but recently he seems to have fallen out of favour. Who knows whether that will hurt him or help him. Peter Turkson is a Ghanaian cardinal, and he would be the first black pope in many, many centuries. He has been pretty outspoken on things like economic justice, poverty, and climate change. So he might also be seen as a continuation to Francis's legacy. And there's many others. There's a Hungarian, there's another Italian, there's a Maltese cardinal, Portuguese, Guinean, lots of different cardinals who could be considered successors, some of them conservative, some of them moderate, some of them progressive. So it remains to be seen.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, what does this kind of mean for all of us people across the world? Obviously, we don't know who the Pope is going to be. The new Pope might give people hope, but it might also dishearten people depending on who he is and what he stands for. But in the meantime, for your everyday Joes over here in Australia or New Zealand or wherever the people are listening from, how should we kind of posture ourselves in preparing for the new Pope? Like, should we make this our main focus right now or going forward, or should we just, I don't know, like, what does this mean for all of us, I suppose? Yeah,
well, look, Zanita, you and I, neither of us are Catholic, and the majority of our audience is probably not Catholic either. And so, you ask a good question, so what? Look, the reality is the Pope sets the stage for a lot of religious discussion around the world, and in many ways has power that no other spiritual leader alive does. The leaders of Islam don't wield such power. The leaders of the Evangelical Church in America and the leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church don't wield such power. The reality that the Catholic Church is the largest Christian denomination in the world, and probably to call them even a Christian denomination is insulting to somebody. The fact that this is a church of more than 1.3 billion people is significant. And so the Pope represents, I think, a real power for different groups and different interests. As we've already discussed, Pope Francis has been a keen advocate for things like climate change and poverty and things like that. And so a leader like that really does have the power to push not just in social causes to private organizations, but to politicians and to countries. The Pope has the power to influence policy that doesn't just affect the people of one country, but the entire world. It would be remiss of me as a Seventh-day Adventist to not mention also the fact that the Pope and the Catholic Church definitely has a role to play in biblical prophecy, whether that's from a historical point of view, seeing where we've come from in the Reformation, and the kind of church and the kind of denominations that we belong to now because of that, but also potentially the future. So whatever that may look like is up to debate, and no doubt it will be debated, and the next Pope will provide some serious conversation in the future. But irrespective of the speculation, the Pope does, I think, represent a force potentially for good or potentially for evil, depending on who you are and depending on the kind of person he is. I think one thing is for sure, whoever the next Pope is going to have his work cut out for him, because the world that we live in right now is much more divided and is much more complicated than I think the world that Pope Francis stepped into back in 2013.
Yeah, absolutely. We wish him luck.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Jesse, for educating us. I'm looking forward to you continuing to keep us updated on the website and Science Socials. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Zanita. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our special episode of Science of the Times and Science Radio. Appreciate you all, and we'll see you in the next episode.